Hi, I'm Jor-El Godsey, president of Heartbeat International. And it was Lisa who basically called and said, hey, would you do a brief history of the pregnancy health movement and kind of weave in some of the abortion recovery realities that part of the history. So I've got a little bit of that, but it's a lot to contain in a short amount of time, so let me jump right in. One of the things I kind of want to walk through in each kind of decade. So 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s, kind of lump a couple of decades together, and then our current present challenges and opportunities. So I don't have a lot as far as a lot of specifics for the present challenge opportunities, because that really would take its own kind of time. So I want to be able to walk through this as a history for us all to kind of understand and really kind of help set our footing better for where we are. So it starts in the 60s. So in the 60s, some of you who weren't there, and some of you who were there but can't remember it. So we really are talking about the sexual revolution. We're talking about really a massive change that occurs culturally across the U.S. and other parts of the globe, of course. But we had, the Vietnam War stuff is happening at that time. I happened to stumble across a couple of different articles that were 5 years apart about the attitude towards abortion in the US, and from 65 to 70 you have this massive swing that occurs. Now whether that's just the culture changing or it's being driven by the culture, which is more likely, and the media that supported abortion even in those days, it happened, and it's why we get to the 70s with kind of a momentum of abortion. But first, what happens in 1967, state of Colorado is the first, under a Republican governor, by the way, is the first to kind of legalize or reduce restrictions on abortion. They're quickly followed by California, Oregon, North Carolina, and New York in 1970. So you begin to see that the beginnings of this happens in the late 60s. And it was a pregnancy helpline that actually struck up in California for helping people. That's first in the US that we know of, where people were organizing to help those who were facing abortion decisions. Because once it happened in one state, it began to happen in other states, either through kind of abortion tourism, where there would be people going to those states to get abortions, or you had, of course, underground abortions that have been happening, not nearly as much as what the folks of Big Abortion would want us to believe or purported, but it was at least happening. And so you have pregnancy help happening in a big way early on, that's where you began to see it occur. We also have the first pregnancy center, which actually is not in the US, but in Toronto, Canada. That was kind of the Louise Summerhill. Eventually this becomes Birthright, and Birthright International eventually. And that's the very first time we see the model of pregnancy, of a pregnancy center location, service location, really develop. Prior to that, it had been happening in doctors' offices of Catholics everywhere. In fact, this is one of the main factors understanding the movement of that day is the Catholics were the ones in the 60s who were really holding the line. They were the only ones, in fact, almost exclusively Catholic, so much so that it was easy for the other side to say, oh, well, you're against abortion and you must be Catholic. And of course, that is not something that the evangelicals or Protestants wanted to be known as. So it was a way that at the time that a political issue could be used as a wedge to divide the community. And it's unfortunate, but even in those days, the evangelical community in particular was not sure that they were against abortion. I can point you to a couple of articles that they were equivocating on, well, maybe it's okay in some instances. Certainly they lacked kind of the grounding, the foundational teaching of the sanctity of life that we so appreciate the Catholicism that was holding that line during that time. So many of our early pregnancy help were doctors and nurses that operated in Catholic settings, Catholic, either their practice, they did this. There was some amazing folks who did that, including some of those who are founders of Heartbeat International. For the sake of our conversation today, hopefully you'll use there are a lot of different ways to refer to pregnancy centers. Crisis pregnancy centers is the old term that almost none of us use, but the other side insists upon using. Some of you will know pregnancy resource centers, PRCs. That they are often set off as being different from pregnancy medical clinics, or PMCs. And then you have a term which is good as well, pregnancy care centers, but we prefer the term pregnancy help center. And then beyond that, pregnancy help organizations, which kind of factors in maternity homes, factors in some nonprofit adoption agencies, hotlines, and others that are doing pregnancy help. We see pregnancy help as a spectrum, from the sidewalk to the classroom, wherever it occurs. We see it as pregnancy help. In the 1970s, moving out of the 60s and into the 70s, we begin to see, well, for one, the founding of Heartbeat International, which is at that time known as AAI, or Alternatives to Abortion International. Then we see, of course, well, in 71 was really coalescing. The founding of Heartbeat really is the call of the pregnancy health movement at that time to say we need something that connects us, that binds us together. So we have our very first conference, actually, put on by AAI at the time, and now we're about to celebrate our 50th this year, in the end of April, and it's a great opportunity to look back at all of this. But then we see that the big occurrence that happens that we all know very well. In January of 1973, Roe v. Wade ruling is handed down. 7 justices out of 9 determined that yes, abortion is a fundamental right according to the Constitution. And of course, that eliminates any of the 30-some states that still had protective measures standing up to abortion. But of course, it affirms abortion as an industry. And they had already been on the rise, but now abortion begins to take off, and you're going to see that kind of culminating, climbing throughout the 80s into the 90s. But something else that happens, a couple things happen. One is Christian Action Council, which is an evangelical organization that becomes CareNet, gets in gear in 1975, kind of originally on the political activism side, and eventually becomes a sister organization of Heartbeat, and that occurs a little bit later. 1979, though, something major happens. C. Everett Koop and Francis Schaeffer. C. Everett Koop went on to be Dr. C. Everett Koop went on to be the Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan. And then Francis Schaeffer, who was a well-known evangelical scholar, published a book called Whatever Happened to the Human Race. And not only was that a book, but it turned into a movie, or a series of videotapes, video VHS. Some of you have to Google that because you're not old enough to remember that. But it was one of those things that actually was shown in churches. And I know a number of people who said, oh yeah, Jor-El, I remember that time when I was able to go to church and I was challenged to my heart to know how to respond, and that I needed to respond to this. And that became very, very important into the 80s. And I'll show you kind of how that was important. But one of the things to be mindful in the 70s, we really began to see kind of a segmenting of the pro-life movement, a specialization, for lack of a better term. Some people see this as fracturing. That claim can be true, but I do believe that it was also an opportunity for us to specialize. And so you have people specializing in public awareness. You have those that are kind of working in the political environment, those who are really serving in the direct service, which is where we see the pregnancy help community happening, and the myriad of pregnancy help centers that begin to start and grow in the 70s. You see some organizations I've got represented here that started in the 70s, and like I note here, Christian Action Council really started as a political effort of advocacy for legislative and legal opportunities, but eventually moved over into direct service to become one of our sister organizations. APLOG there is the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which was a direct result of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, ACOG, making a dramatic turn towards abortion and favoring and really having an abortion bias. So you have a whole group that splinters off from that. Right to Life and American Life League jump in, and they're kind of on both sides, political and public awareness, but originally they were really focused on public awareness. So that's the 70s. Traction begins to happen, things begin to occur, it kind of growing. You have that big thing that happens at the end of the 70s, where the evangelical community kind of gets challenged to get engaged. And so one thing we see happen in 1983 is a major expansion of PHC start. I'm going to show you that then in a graph form. We have the very first pregnancy help center with ultrasound, occurs actually in California, led by a doctor who kind of had a very holistic medicine practice. So we see this as a big thing now. We could forget that it actually began with a vision back in 1985, and it took a while to get going because that was a bit of a challenge, but to meet the requirements at that time. But it was something that was kind of sown. The seeds of that were sown in the mid 80s. Also in the mid 80s, we see post-abortion research and outreach begins to happen kind of in earnest. We see Dr. David Reardon's studies begin to pop up. Philip Ney and Vincent Rue, these folks begin to, Teresa Burke, a psychologist, begins to, in her counseling practice, begins to see evidence of how abortion is impacting women in particular. And then Gloria Allred, at the end of the 80s, Gloria Allred wins a Pregnancy Help Center lawsuit. It was about pregnancy testing and is that the practice of medicine. And you know that there were some good things that came out of it for us, and but it was a bit of a challenge to go through. Personally, the 80s starts in one place for me. I was I helped my girlfriend get an abortion, and so that's my abortion story. Begins in the early 80s. And something I carried into throughout the 80s and kind of set it aside, let it go. But it wasn't until I had a conversion experience and was sitting in church on one Sunday morning, actually in 1987, was when I was challenged from the pulpit. It felt like the preacher was talking directly to me, and I was challenged personally to get engaged. And so he was there to challenge all of us. So we literally left our church that Sunday morning and went and picketed an abortion doctor. And personally, I got involved much greater level quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was doing rescues with Operation Rescue and getting arrested and going to jail. And that certainly was a radical transformation. I can go right to that moment when my heart was challenged, both on the subject matter as a whole in our nation, but also personally. And I also walked through abortion recovery, abortion healing through that process. And I was grateful for that path, that opportunity. And so in the 80s, this big thing occurs. So you have this spike. We went back and did a graph of, we used our information here at Heartbeat of all of the centers that we know of and the year the services began. And so you see this big spike of establishing organizations and serving clients happens right square in the middle of the 80s. Powerful time, 84, 85, 86. And we're celebrating those many of those organizations and their growth and what happened, and you continue to see this growth that was occurring over time. Now, most of the pregnancy centers of that day kind of fit a three-part model where you have ministry that's happening across three different things. Of course, the big one in the middle is intervention. That's the primary reason that these were formed, was to help women who were in the midst of an abortion decision. But quickly it became obvious that we have to get out ahead of that with prevention. And if nothing else, help those that are coming in and seeing us with negative tests. They're not pregnant, so there's not a baby involved in this situation, but we can begin to help them see how they can avoid this in the future. And then later it goes to schools and other opportunities to begin, and that's its own path. I won't talk about much more than that, but reconciliation, abortion recovery begins to happen as a part of these 1980s in particular, because women were presenting with challenges. They were wrestling with this issue. The minute you'd see a presentation in a church, somebody would come forward, and of course we know the statistics are amazing, that in any group of women, we know that a third to a fourth, depending upon the generation, are going to have experienced abortion personally. And so the idea of abortion recovery becomes woven into the fabric of pregnancy help, these outreaches, the centers in particular. And this begins to take shape more so in the 90s. One of the things that happens early in the 90s is NIFLA is founded. Now, NIFLA is National Institute of Family Life Advocates, run by Tom Glessner and with Ann O'Connor, who's been in the movement for a long time as well. And they began to found this with the idea of working in the legal side as well as in the eventually in the medical side. So they become really champions for medical services and centers, and that really takes root in the 2000s. But in the middle of the 90s, some key things happen. Rachel's Vineyard book by Teresa Burke gets published, and she goes on to kind of create this setting, the weekend, Rachel's Vineyard weekends, where healing occurs, or at least begins to occur. And then Linda Cochran, also in the middle 90s, publishes Forgiven and Set Free, which is widely used today. And of course, there are many others. This is just kind of, these are the early well-known examples of this occurring. But something else really cool happens in the 1990s. As abortion was beginning to decline, the number of abortion clinics began to be reduced. And eventually, in 1996, we finally exceeded the number of abortion clinics by one in 1996. And so that was a momentous moment, and we celebrate it to this day. But there's more good news coming as well. But let me show you really the abortion numbers in kind of graph form here, where you see the high watermark for abortions as counted by Guttmacher is really 1.6 million in 1990 and begins a steady decline. Now, this chart stops at 2011, but that decline continues. As of 2017, I believe we're now down to about 860 or 880,000 abortions. Now that's 880,000 too many, but that's at least we've been moving in the right direction. Can't promise you it's going to stay that way, because there's been some other difficult developments in recent years that is going to challenge that. But we also see Planned Parenthood gets more and more in the abortion business. Of course, we know Planned Parenthood is the number one abortion provider in the country, in the US. In the 2000s, we step into some interesting things. 2003, Option Line is founded. And this is really built as a joint venture of both Heartbeat International and CareNet. Decide to collaborate and create a 24/7 call center. Just recently, we celebrated 4 million contacts at Option Line since that time, 2003. Just turned 18, by the way, a couple months ago. And they to this day, they answer now not just the phones, but chat, email, text, all of which kind of have developed and grown over since that founding. They answer about 1,000 contacts every single day. ICU Mobile, Image Clear Ultrasound, launches their first unit in 2003. Now, they're not the first ones to do mobile unit pregnancy center. I think there were a few running around in the late 90s, but they're the first group that really kind of solidifies it as a focus of their ministry to grow that. And then ultrasounds begin to multiply. We see that happen powerfully through Focus on the Family, starts Option Ultrasound program in 2003. And then later in 2009 is when Knights of Columbus jumps in and makes this happen. So both of those have put out thousands of ultrasounds throughout the last now 15, 16 years. There's been many centers that have been blessed, not just with their first machine, but with a newer machine, because this is dynamic technology, and where it was dominated by 2D, now has 3D, 4D, powerful stuff, life-affirming images going out there. And at this time, somewhat, abortion recovery begins to step back into it, step back a little as we focus on medical services. Not intentionally, sometimes, just as a matter of course. Two other things happened in the 2000s I want to touch on. One is that the Abortion Pill Rescue Network starts under Dr. Delgado. He was the second doctor that we know of after Dr. Matt Harrison that was able to meet a woman between pill number 1 and pill number 2 of an abortion pill regimen and help her rescue her baby through progesterone. So we're blessed to have that as a reality. Then he started the network. It's grown since then, and now is a part of Heartbeat International, which we get to run. And in 2018, major thing occurs. Actually, this story begins in 2015 with California taking on the pregnancy centers in their state, demanding that they basically promote abortions in their centers. And this, of course, is an overreach of government. SCOTUS came in, Supreme Court of the United States came in and said, yes, it is. And that victory occurred in 2018. Doesn't mean there's not still trying. One of the things that we see today, as the 2000s continue, is we see services in pregnancy health centers. We see about 79% of pregnancy centers report some type of abortion recovery effort. Typically, it follows a familiar pattern of a group ministry. We see incentive programs and ultrasound on-site services growing, particularly ultrasound now is more than 73% of centers that we are connected to are reporting that many. One of the cool things that happened though, or I should say that is the now, is pregnancy centers have now total more pregnancy health center locations than Chick-fil-A has restaurants, Chipotle, or Panera. And we have more centers than Staples and Office Depot, Office Max combined. Or if it works better for you to see it as so many Big Lots around and Kohl's, if you put those together, we still have more locations than they do. But the big number I want to point to is the 1 in 4. And there's 1 in 4, for every 1 abortion clinic, there are now 4 pregnancy help centers. So that's a major milestone that we're excited to always champion. But the big shift that's been going on is the big shift that involves chemical abortions. As you can see, the number has been declining. This the greenish graph here is from Guttmacher themselves. They're the research arm of big abortion. And you can see the total number of abortions coming down, but the number of what they call medication abortions, which we call chemical abortions, have been going up. But fortunately, abortion pill rescue has been growing, and we now count 2,000 women who have we've helped save their babies through abortion pill reversal. And so we're excited for that number to continue to grow, because it needs to grow a lot more, because the big abortion is making a huge shift now. We believe in 2020, about 50% of all abortions were chemical abortions. And so that gives us a couple of challenges that we have. We need to be adapting for greater impact, because the landscape is adapting. So there's kind of 3 areas that I really want to touch on about adapting, and that's outreach, messaging, nimbleness. So we need to expand our methodology. Thinking that abortion is going to be tackled simply by staying in our pregnancy centers, not enough. We need to expand and rethink how we do those. We need to strengthen our services, extend our reach. Virtual is going to be a must in the years to come. We need to modernize our methods. Sometimes hey, old school is good school, but at the same time, we need to adapt to where we are and what's coming down the road. Old messaging won't connect with the current generation. So learning how to talk is as important as what we talk about. And we need to engage the target demographic for help reaching the target demographic. That's key, always has been, but even more so now as the younger generations are rising up, total digital natives, and we need to serve them better and better. And that means we need to keep our ministries adaptive, that they need to be nimble to really maintain an effective cutting edge. We need new practices that will be necessary. We're not just going to be able to wait for what's best, because that will be costly in lives and in time. So we need to continue to grow and serve. And that's one of the things that is going to be a mark for both abortion recovery as well as for pregnancy help, and how those ministries go forward and serve many, many more. So it's a privilege to be with you. And one of the things I appreciate Peggy Hartshorn, our longtime president before me, and our current board chair has said, and I believe she stole it for someone else, but it's a great saying and a true saying, that the best alternative to abortion is another person. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you. I just pray God's blessing go with you as you reach out with love and compassion to those that are facing or have faced abortions. And